The Grave Watcher. The grass is wet. 3 in the morning, October 1827, Philadelphia. A man named Samuel Wright sits on a folding stool beside a fresh grave in Potter's Field, his lantern casting shadows that move when the wind moves. The air smells of turned earth and the kerosene in his lamp. His coat is heavy with moisture, but does not keep him warm. In his right hand, a club. In his left, nothing. He keeps that hand free. Around him, darkness extends in every direction until it meets the shapes of headstones and the low stone wall at the cemetery's edge. The silence is not complete. Somewhere beyond the wall, footsteps, or maybe the sound of a shovel striking dirt, or maybe nothing. Samuel has been awake for 31 hours. He will sit here until dawn. This wasn't a job. It was a vigil held against men who worked in the same darkness. Was Samuel Wright protecting the dead, or protecting what the living needed to believe about them? Chapter 1. The Currency of Flesh. Between 1790 and 1832, a human corpse in America could earn what a laborer made in 3 months. Medical schools needed bodies. The law said only executed criminals could be dissected. But by 1800, the number of medical students exceeded the number of executed criminals by a ratio of 20 to 1. Surgery was becoming a science. Anatomy required fresh cadavers. The dead had to come from somewhere. They came from graveyards. Men calling themselves resurrectionists worked at night with wooden shovels that made less noise than metal. They dug down to the head end of the coffin, not the full length. Faster that way. They broke the lid open. They hooked a rope under the corpse's arms or around its neck. They pulled. The body came up. The clothes and jewelry went back into the coffin. Stealing those was a felony. Stealing a corpse was, legally, nothing. A body had no owner. It was not property. It could not be stolen because it did not belong to anyone. This created a market. By 1828, a fresh corpse sold for 8 to 16 guineas in Britain, equivalent to $400 in modern American currency. In the United States, prices varied by city. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Baltimore, anywhere with medical schools. In 1891, a newspaper reported that body snatchers received $80 for a single corpse. Adjusted for inflation, that's $2,100 today. The most skilled resurrectionists could open a grave, extract a body, and restore the site to an undisturbed appearance in under an hour. Rain helped. Soft ground meant faster digging. Some worked in teams of 3, 1 digger, 1 puller, 1 lookout. Others worked alone. The faster they worked, the more bodies they could deliver, the more they earned. Medical professors paid. They asked no questions. The anatomical theaters needed material. Students needed experience. The progression of medicine depended on dissection. Everyone understood this. No one wanted to discuss where the bodies came from. And so families hired men to sit in graveyards through the night, to watch over the dead until decomposition made them worthless to the trade. Chapter 2. The Terms of Employment. Grave watching was not formal work. No union represented these men. No government agency regulated their hours or wages. Families contracted directly with watchmen, usually for a period of 4 to 6 weeks after burial, the time required for a body to decay beyond use for dissection. Payment varied by location and family wealth. In some cases, relatives took shifts themselves, sitting through the night beside fresh graves. But sustained vigilance required someone willing to endure weeks of nocturnal isolation. The watchmen who accepted this work were often drawn from the same economic class as those they protected. Men who needed money but had limited options. Some were gravediggers who took on additional duties. Others were unemployed laborers, men too old for physical trades, individuals on the margins of the economy who could tolerate discomfort for pay. Records from hospital employment in the early 1800s listed watchmen among the lowest paid staff positions. At marine hospitals during the 1810s, watchmen earned wages comparable to laborers and porters, below bakers, below nurses, far below anyone with specialized skills. The exact figures are difficult to verify for cemetery watchmen specifically, but contemporary sources suggest daily wages of 50 to 75 cents for night watch work, less than what a carpenter earned, roughly equivalent to what an unskilled day laborer made. But cemetery watchmen worked alone. They worked in darkness. They worked surrounded by the dead, knowing that the men they watched for were armed, desperate, and practiced at violence. Some cemeteries employed permanent staff watchmen who patrolled multiple burial grounds. These positions paid better, perhaps $8 to $10 per month, but required nightly rounds through acres of graves in all weather. Other watchmen were hired by individual families for single graves, paid per night or per week. The work was not consistent. A watchman might sit at one grave for a month, then have no employment for weeks until another family needed protection. There was no guarantee of continuous income. The trade depended on death, and death, while constant, was unpredictable in its distribution. What remains clear is that the compensation did not match the psychological cost. Chapter 3. The Catalog of Risks. Body snatchers carried weapons. Watchmen carried weapons. The graveyards became battlefields. In 1825, a sentry at Bully's Acre in Dublin captured Thomas Tweet with 5 bodies in his possession. Tweet's pockets contained human teeth, a set fetched £1 sterling then, equivalent to £50 by 2011. Teeth were valuable. Dentists needed them for dentures. The market for body parts extended beyond complete corpses. Resurrectionists worked with speed and precision. They knew cemetery layouts. They bribed officials. In some cases, the watchmen themselves took payments to look away. Corruption was common. Gravediggers, sextons, cemetery workers. Some cooperated with the very thieves they were supposed to prevent. Violence occurred regularly. Watchmen were murdered. Body snatchers were shot. In some cities, mobs formed when graves were discovered opened. Resurrection riots, they were called. Crowds attacked anatomical schools, threatened surgeons, destroyed equipment. But the watchmen worked alone, and the rioters came after the theft was discovered. During the hours of darkness, a single man sat with his lantern and his club, waiting. The physical dangers were obvious. The psychological dangers were slower to manifest. By the 1880s, medical literature identified a condition specific to cemetery watchmen, the term used by sextons and gravediggers, tombstone madness, a form of melancholia distinct from other recognized mental illnesses. An article from that period stated that so many watchmen had lost their reason through night duty in cemeteries that the profession came to believe the work itself caused insanity. The symptoms: paranoia, hallucinations, severe anxiety, inability to distinguish real sounds from imagined ones, acute fear responses, obsessive thoughts about death and decay, social withdrawal, insomnia, even when off duty. One watchman at Glenwood Cemetery explained to a reporter that 5 out of 6 men placed in graveyard watch duty would, within a short time, feel themselves going mad. To succeed in the profession, he said, a man needed to be as impressible as brick and mortar. Any imagination was a liability. Soldiers detailed to guard President Garfield's tomb at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland went insane. Multiple men. It made newspapers. The isolation, the darkness, the endless hours staring at tombstones. Something in the work broke them. Yet the work continued. Chapter 4. The architecture of defense communities built structures to assist the watchers. Watch houses appeared in cemeteries across Britain and America. Small buildings, often circular, with a fireplace and narrow windows facing the burial grounds. The watchman could sit inside, somewhat protected from weather, with sightlines across the graves. Some of these buildings still stand. In Scotland particularly, they remain as architectural evidence of a specific fear. Other defenses were more elaborate. Mort safes, heavy iron frameworks, or cages placed over graves, made excavation nearly impossible. These weighed hundreds of pounds. Resurrectionists would need hours to move them, and hours meant detection. Mort houses served a different function. Circular structures where coffins could be stored for 6 weeks after death, secured behind locked doors until the bodies inside decayed sufficiently. Families paid for temporary storage. When decomposition reached the point where anatomists would reject the corpse, it was buried. Bullskin Graveyard in Scotland contains an example. The wealthy commissioned iron coffins, lead-lined caskets, vaults sealed with marble slabs weighing tons. These measures worked through simple physics. The effort required to access the body exceeded the value of obtaining it. For those without wealth, the options were limited. Families took shifts. They placed objects on graves, stones, flowers, personal items, arranged in patterns that would reveal disturbance. They mixed explosives into the coffins. The coffin torpedo, patented in 1896, was a spring-loaded device that detonated if the casket was forced open. Watch clubs formed. Groups of neighbors organized rotating night shifts, each member serving several hours before being replaced. This spread the burden and reduced individual exposure to the psychological strain. But these solutions required resources, organization, sustained effort. For the poor, for the isolated, for those who died in prisons or workhouses, protection was minimal. Their graves were raided first and most frequently, and the watchmen sat in the darkness, knowing that their presence deterred some thieves but not all, that their weapons might save a body or might result in their own death, that the work they performed was necessary only because medicine required what the law did not provide. Chapter 5. The scale of what was guarded. Step back. Consider the system. By 1828, London and Edinburgh alone had more than 1,000 medical students who each required multiple dissections per year. The United States saw rapid growth in medical education during the same period. By 1840, 19 medical schools operated in the country. By 1860, 47. Each needed anatomical specimens. Each generated demand for corpses. The only legal source, executed criminals. Between 1800 and 1830, Britain executed approximately 100 people per year. Medical education required thousands of bodies annually. The mathematics made illegal procurement inevitable. Grave watching, then, was not the protection of isolated families. It was a labor force that attempted to counterbalance an entire underground economy. In cities with medical schools, dozens of watchmen worked simultaneously, each guarding different burial sites, each performing the same vigilance against the same threat. This created a distributed defense system. No central authority coordinated it. No government funded it. It operated through individual contracts, family desperation, and the willingness of working-class men to accept dangerous, psychologically damaging employment in exchange for wages that barely exceeded poverty level. The system was inefficient. Bodies were stolen despite watchers. Watchmen were bribed or killed. Graves were raided during shift changes, during storms when visibility dropped, during the brief period between burial and the commencement of watch duty. But the system persisted because families needed it. The theft of a loved one's body was not merely a property crime. It was a spiritual violation. Religious belief held that resurrection required an intact body. To be dissected meant eternal separation from God, from family, from salvation itself. Grave watchers stood between the living and that terror. They were not soldiers. They were not police. They were ordinary men performing extraordinary vigilance, compensating through sleeplessness and risk for a legal framework that refused to acknowledge what medicine required. And medicine advanced. Anatomy became precise. Surgery improved. Lives were saved through knowledge gained from cadavers that came, in many cases, from graves guarded inadequately or not at all. The watchers held the line, but the line moved every night. Chapter 6. The paranormal that wasn't stories accumulated. Watchmen reported experiences that defied explanation. Voices in empty cemeteries, figures moving between headstones where no living person stood. The sensation of being watched when alone. Sounds of digging when no shovel struck earth. Lights that appeared and vanished without source. One watchman at Glenwood Cemetery told reporters that men frequently mistook tombstones for ghosts when clouds obscured the moon. That owls, with their mournful calls, seemed like unquiet spirits haunting the bodies they once inhabited. Another watchman was found dead across a grave, shot by his own revolver. The official conclusion: some fearful creation of imagination terrified him so completely that he chose death over confronting it. The stories spread. They became part of the profession's lore. Cemetery watchmen were thought to encounter supernatural phenomena with such regularity that insanity was considered an occupational inevitability. But there are grounded explanations for every reported symptom. Sleep deprivation causes auditory and visual hallucinations. Men working 30-hour shifts, awake for days at a time, unable to rest even during daylight because they knew the next night waited. Their brains manufactured experiences that felt real but originated internally. Isolation produces paranoia. Human psychology requires social contact. Prolonged solitude, especially in darkness, creates hypervigilance. The mind searches for threats. It finds them whether they exist or not. Pattern recognition becomes overactive. Every shadow suggests movement. Every sound suggests approach. Trauma compounds. Men who witness body snatchers opening graves, who fought off armed thieves, who discovered coffins already, violated. These experiences embedded themselves as intrusive memories. The watchmen relived them during subsequent nights. The past bled into the present. What they feared might happen felt indistinguishable from what was happening. Chronic stress alters brain chemistry. Cortisol levels remain elevated. The amygdala stays activated. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational assessment, functions poorly. Decision-making deteriorates. Emotional regulation fails. The symptoms match what 19th century observers called tombstone madness. But the watchmen themselves rarely analyzed their experiences clinically. They lived inside them, and from inside, the work felt cursed. The dead seemed restless. The night seemed alive with threat. Whether supernatural or neurological, the effect remained the same. Good men went to cemeteries and came back broken, if they came back at all. Chapter 7. The Anatomy Act and After. In 1832, Britain passed the Anatomy Act. It should have ended everything. The legislation gave medical schools legal access to unclaimed bodies, those who died in workhouses, hospitals, prisons without family to claim them. The poor, essentially, the friendless, the abandoned. Their bodies became property of the state, available for dissection without consent. The act was intended to eliminate body snatching by making grave robbery unnecessary. If medical schools could obtain cadavers legally, the market for stolen corpses would collapse. Resurrectionists would have no buyers. Grave watching would become obsolete. It worked, partially. Body snatching decreased. The most notorious resurrectionists disappeared from public record. Medical schools reported adequate supply of anatomical specimens. The underground trade diminished significantly, but it did not vanish. Some families still hired watchmen. Some graves were still raided. The trade moved to the margins, became more careful, left fewer traces, and the watchmen who had made their living protecting graves found themselves unemployed. The Anatomy Act transferred the burden from one group to another. Families no longer needed to guard their dead, but the poor who died alone now had their bodies taken legally by the same institutions that once took them illegally. Dissection, previously a punishment reserved for executed murderers, became the fate of anyone too poor to avoid it. American states passed similar legislation over the following decades. Massachusetts in 1834, New York in 1854. By 1900, most states had laws permitting medical schools to claim unclaimed bodies. Grave watching as a profession faded. The watch houses emptied. The mort safes were removed. The mort houses closed. The coffin torpedoes were never widely adopted. Too dangerous, too expensive, rendered unnecessary by legal reform. But the psychological damage to those who had performed the work did not fade with the profession. Men who had spent years in cemeteries, who had developed tombstone madness, who had learned to function in darkness and isolation, they carried those patterns forward. Many never recovered normal sleep. Many remained paranoid. Some had been institutionalized. Others simply disappeared from records, their fates unknown. The law changed. The need for watchers ended. But the cost they had paid was already extracted. Chapter 8. The Numbers That Quantified Terror. Consider the scope in figures. Between 1780 and 1832, Britain had approximately 60,000 medical students who needed anatomical training. Each required access to multiple cadavers during their education. Estimates suggest 3 bodies per student minimum. That's 180,000 corpses needed. Legal supply during that period. Executed criminals. Britain executed roughly 100 people per year. 5,200 total over 52 years. This left a deficit of approximately 174,800 bodies. The gap was filled by resurrectionists. In Edinburgh alone, between 1825 and 1830, medical schools consumed between 400 and 800 bodies per year. Only a handful came from executions. The rest were stolen from graves. Prices for stolen corpses increased as watchmen made procurement more difficult. In 1800, a body sold for 1 to 2 guineas. By 1828, the price had risen to 8 to 16 guineas, an increase of 400 to 800%. In modern equivalent, a single corpse could sell for the same amount an unskilled laborer earned in 14 to 28 weeks. The number of watchmen is harder to quantify. No central records tracked them, but based on burial rates in major cities and the reported practice of families hiring guards for 4 to 6 weeks post-burial, Philadelphia alone likely employed between 50 and 100 watchmen simultaneously during peak periods in the 1820s. New York, Boston, Baltimore, similar numbers. Britain's major cities had even more. These were men working 10 to 12-hour night shifts, sometimes longer. A watchman might sit through 300 hours guarding a single grave over 6 weeks. If employed continuously, which was rare, that's over 3,000 hours per year spent in cemeteries at night. For comparison, a standard work year now is approximately 2,080 hours. Mortality rates for the profession are unknown. How many watchmen were killed by body snatchers? How many died by suicide? How many were institutionalized for tombstone madness? The records don't specify. The men were too marginal, too replaceable, too far outside the formal economy to warrant documentation. What remains clear: this was mass labor. Thousands of men, across multiple countries, over several decades, performing nocturnal vigilance against an illegal trade that medicine required and the law refused to address. And when the Anatomy Act eliminated their employment, they vanished from history almost as completely as the corpses they had tried to protect. In Chapter 9, The Industry of Complicity. The system required cooperation from those meant to prevent it. Sextons, the cemetery caretakers, had keys to burial grounds. They knew which graves were fresh. They understood which families could afford iron coffins and which could not. Some took payments from resurrectionists to provide information, to leave gates unlocked, to ensure watchmen looked elsewhere at critical moments. Grave diggers worked similar angles. They dug the graves. They knew the depth, the soil consistency, how long exhumation would take. For a fee, they could dig shallower than standard, making the work faster. They could note which coffins were cheap wood versus reinforced construction. Even watchmen themselves occasionally collaborated. A man earning 75 cents per night might accept $5 to walk his rounds slowly, to spend extra time at the far end of the cemetery, to fail to notice certain sounds. The temptation was significant. The oversight was minimal. Medical school staff sometimes dealt directly with resurrectionists. The professorship of anatomy at many institutions explicitly included obtaining specimens among its duties. Faculty maintained funds for this purpose. Students were told not to ask questions about sourcing. The procurement of bodies was considered an unfortunate necessity, discussed obliquely if at all. This created a layered system of willful ignorance. Families paid watchmen who sometimes betrayed them. Cemetery workers who promised security sometimes sold information. Doctors who taught anatomy used bodies they knew came from crimes, but claimed plausible deniability. Law enforcement investigated sporadically, usually only when public pressure became intense. The result: body snatching functioned as an open secret. Everyone understood it happened. Few acknowledged it directly. The legal ambiguity, that stealing a corpse was not technically theft, provided cover. The social stigma attached to discussing death provided more. Watchmen existed within this system as both obstacle and participant. Some were incorruptible. Others were for sale. Most fell somewhere between. Men who did the work, but understood that success was impossible, that bodies would be stolen despite their vigilance, that the trade would continue regardless of their efforts. They sat in darkness, knowing they were part of an elaborate performance. Families needed to believe protection was possible. Society needed to believe the dead were safe. Medicine needed bodies, regardless of where they came from. The Watchmen provided the theater of security. Sometimes it was real. Often it was not. Chapter 10. The hours between night and morning. What does a man think about for 10 hours in a graveyard? The question seems simple. The answer is not documented. Watchmen left few written records. The job did not attract literacy. The men who performed it were not historians of their own experience. But the conditions can be reconstructed. A wooden stool or a folding chair. A lantern that needed periodic refueling. A coat that never quite kept out the cold. A club or pistol within reach. The smell of earth, grass, the faint chemical scent of embalming fluid if the burial was recent enough. The darkness was not uniform. Moonlight created shadows. Clouds moved, trees swayed. Headstones reflected light in ways that suggested movement where none existed. The human eye, in low light, sees motion that isn't there. It's a survival mechanism. Better to perceive threat falsely than to miss actual danger. Sounds carried strangely at night. Wind through leaves. Animals moving in underbrush. Distant traffic. Church bells marking hours. Rain on the lantern glass. The watchman's own breathing. His heartbeat when fear spiked. All of it amplified by isolation. Time moves slowly. 10 hours feels longer when nothing happens. The watchman couldn't read. Insufficient light, and reading required looking away from the graves. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't pace far from his post. He sat. He watched. He listened. Some brought food. Others couldn't eat in cemeteries. Some spoke aloud to themselves, maintaining consciousness through the sound of their own voice. Others enforced silence, believing noise attracted attention. The cold was constant. Even summer nights dropped in temperature before dawn. The watchman's body grew stiff. His joints ached. His eyes strained. Fatigue accumulated in ways that sitting, paradoxically, did not relieve. And always, the knowledge that men might come, that violence might occur, that the body he guarded might be stolen despite his presence, that his own safety depended on vigilance, that sleep deprivation made nearly impossible. The work was not dramatic. It was boring, punctuated by terror. Hours of nothing, then sounds that might be resurrectionists, or might be wind. Every shift was a gamble. Most nights, nothing happened. But which nights? The watchman couldn't know. So he stayed alert, night after night, until the contracted period ended or his mind broke. This was the actual labor, not fighting off body snatchers, though that happened, but enduring the prolonged psychological stress of waiting for something that probably wouldn't happen, but absolutely might. Chapter 11. The women who also watch the historical record emphasizes male watchmen, but women performed this labor too. Family members watching their own dead were often women, wives, mothers, daughters. When a household buried a husband or child and lacked money to hire a watchman, the surviving women took shifts. They sat in near cemeteries just as men did. They faced the same risks. They developed the same fears. The difference: women were not paid for this work. It was classified as family duty rather than employment. The same hours, the same conditions, none of the compensation. Women also served as mourners for hire. Body snatchers employed women to attend funerals and assess potential targets. These women would observe the burial, note the coffin quality, estimate family wealth, determine whether watchmen would be hired. They reported back. The information helped resurrectionists plan their thefts. So women existed on both sides of the conflict. Some protected graves. Others provided intelligence that led to their violation. Neither role was safe. Women sitting alone in cemeteries at night faced threats beyond body snatchers. Sexual assault was a constant possibility. Violence unrelated to corpse theft. Robbery of the watchmen themselves, taking their payment, their possessions, leaving them beaten or worse. Women rarely reported these incidents. When they did, authorities often dismissed the claims. A woman alone at night in a cemetery was considered to be inviting danger. Victim blaming preceded modern terminology, but not modern practice. The few historical accounts that mention female watchmen describe them as particularly effective, less physically imposing than men, but more observant, better at remaining still for extended periods, more attuned to subtle changes in environment. These are generalizations, possibly gendered stereotypes, but they appear repeatedly in period sources. What's certain? Women performed this labor. They did so for less recognition. They endured the same psychological damage. Tombstone madness did not discriminate by sex. And when the Anatomy Act ended the practice, women watchmen disappeared from record even more completely than men. They were never counted officially. Their work was never formally recognized. They simply stopped appearing in the narratives as though they had never been there at all. Chapter 12. The Race and Class of the Dead. Not all graves received equal protection. Resurrectionists targeted poor cemeteries, potters' fields, pauper burial grounds, places where the interred had no family wealth, no social standing, no one willing or able to pay for watchmen. These graves were raided systematically. In America, African American cemeteries were particular targets. Racism made these thefts low risk. Law enforcement rarely investigated. Families had limited legal recourse. Medical schools used these bodies extensively. Students dissected enslaved people and free black citizens alike, often with explicit racial justification. The claim that anatomical differences required separate study. This was not incidental. It was structural. The entire system of anatomical supply in the United States depended on racial and economic inequality. The wealthy bought iron coffins and hired permanent watchmen. The poor had their bodies stolen. Black Americans, whether free or enslaved, faced theft even when families attempted protection. Some estimates suggest that in northern cities during the early 1800s, African American bodies represented 70% of dissection subjects, despite African Americans being less than 10% of the population. The disparity was not accidental. It was policy implemented through 1,000 individual acts of theft and purchase. Watchmen in black cemeteries faced unique challenges. They protected graves that resurrectionists specifically targeted. They had less support from law enforcement. They operated in communities with fewer resources to pay them. Many worked without compensation, motivated by outrage rather than wages. And when the Anatomy Act and similar American legislation legalized the use of unclaimed bodies, the racial disparity continued. The law defined unclaimed as those who died without family to retrieve them. But institutional racism meant that black families often couldn't claim relatives who died in hospitals or prisons. The bodies were declared unclaimed, then dissected, entirely legally. The watchmen who tried to protect these graves were fighting not just body snatchers, but a social order that considered certain lives more disposable than others. Their vigilance mattered to the families. It changed nothing systemically. Chapter 13. The Madness. Explained and unexplained. Medical science now understands what tombstone madness was. Prolonged exposure to chronic stress causes measurable changes in brain structure. The amygdala, the fear center, enlarges. The hippocampus, responsible for memory and emotional regulation, shrinks. These are not metaphorical changes. They appear on imaging. They persist even after the stress ends. Sleep deprivation alone produces symptoms matching those described in Watchmen: paranoia, hallucinations, impaired judgment, emotional instability. Add isolation. Humans are social animals. We require contact, and the effects intensify. Add the specific fear of violence, the constant vigilance against threat, and you create conditions guaranteed to damage mental health. Shift work disrupts circadian rhythms. The body operates on a roughly 24-hour cycle. Working nights contradicts this. Even with adequate sleep during daytime, the internal clock remains misaligned. Long-term night shift work correlates with depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction. Watchmen experienced all of this simultaneously: chronic stress, sleep deprivation, social isolation, circadian disruption, and fear. The combination was toxic. But here's what remains uncertain: the reports of specific delusions. Multiple watchmen described identical hallucinations, figures moving between graves, sounds of digging where no one dug, the sensation of being pursued. If these were purely neurological, why the similarity? Possible explanations. Shared cultural narratives shaped the hallucinations. Everyone knew stories about ghosts in cemeteries. Under stress, the brain produces experiences that match expectations. The watchmen saw what they expected to see. Or, some reports were real, not supernatural. Resurrectionists actually were present, actually did move between graves, actually did create sounds. The watchmen weren't hallucinating. They were detecting genuine threats their conscious mind couldn't fully process. Or, a combination. Real threats and imagined ones became indistinguishable. The watchman heard digging. Was it body snatchers? Or wind moving branches? Or his exhausted mind creating sound? He couldn't know. Neither can we, reading the account centuries later. What's indisputable? The work damaged people. Men went to cemeteries sane and left broken. Whether the cause was neurology or trauma or something else, the effect was identical. The job destroyed them. Chapter 14. The Decline of the Vigil Grave. Watching ended not with drama, but with irrelevance. The Anatomy Act of 1832. similar American legislation through the mid-1800s. Medical schools gained legal access to bodies. The underground market contracted. Families stopped hiring watchmen. Cemetery boards discontinued permanent guard positions. By 1850, grave watching in major British cities had virtually ceased. America followed a slower timeline, state by state, as legislation passed incrementally. But by 1870, the profession existed only in rural areas and small towns where old fears persisted despite legal changes. The watch houses fell into disrepair. Some were demolished. Others were converted to tool sheds or storage. A few remain, historical curiosities, small stone buildings with narrow windows facing graves that no longer require protection. The men who had worked as watchmen dispersed into other employment. Some became cemetery groundskeepers. Related work, during daylight, psychologically easier. Others left entirely, found factory jobs, manual labor, anything that did not require sitting alone in darkness. But many couldn't transition. Tombstone madness had no treatment in the 19th century. Men who had broken mentally remained broken. Families cared for them when possible. Poorhouses took them when families couldn't. Asylums accepted the worst cases. Most simply, disappeared from historical record. No one calculated the total cost. How many watchmen died during their employment? How many went insane? How many suffered permanent psychological damage? The questions weren't asked. The labor was too marginal to warrant investigation. What did continue? The medical use of unclaimed bodies. The Anatomy Act shifted the source from stolen to legal, but the fundamental transaction remained. Poor people died. Their bodies were taken. Students dissected them. Medicine advanced. This part of the system never changed. The watchmen had served as interface between families and the inevitable. They couldn't stop the theft. They could only delay it, make it more difficult, provide the illusion of control. When legal reform eliminated the need for delay, the watchmen became unnecessary. They were never thanked. No monuments were erected. No historical societies formed to preserve their stories. They performed necessary labor under impossible conditions, broke under the strain, and were forgotten the moment their service ended. Chapter 15. The Modern Cemetery Night. Cemeteries in 2025 employ security, but not watchmen. Cameras replace human presence. Motion sensors detect unauthorized entry. Lighting systems eliminate the darkness that once concealed theft. The technology is sophisticated. It's also impersonal. No one sits alone keeping vigil. Modern cemetery workers are groundskeepers, administrative staff, funeral directors. They work business hours. They perform maintenance, coordinate burials, manage records. The job involves no psychological terror. No one develops tombstone madness, maintaining databases and mowing grass. Body snatching still occurs, but rarely. Modern cases involve specific criminal intent, identity theft, organ harvesting, sexual deviance. These are individual crimes, not systematic trade. Medical schools have legal cadaver sources. The economic incentive that drove 19th century resurrection men no longer exists. What persists? The work of sitting with the dead. Funeral homes offer overnight viewing. Families sometimes request someone stay with the body until burial. Religious traditions in various cultures require constant attendance on the deceased. This labor continues, but in climate-controlled buildings, with electric lighting, surrounded by living mourners rather than empty darkness. The psychological impact of proximity to death remains measurable. Mortuary workers, funeral directors, and death industry professionals show elevated rates of depression and anxiety compared to general population. The exposure is different. They process death clinically, during daylight, with support systems, but it still exacts cost. Cemetery workers occasionally report unease working early morning or late evening shifts. The setting provokes ancient fears even when rational mind knows the dead are secure. Evolution wired humans to avoid corpses. Modern reasoning doesn't fully override that programming. So the emotional core of grave watching, facing death and darkness, alone, remains uncomfortable even when the practical dangers have vanished. The difference? No one is required to do it anymore. The technology handles security. The institution handles logistics. The individual human no longer bears the weight alone, except in the developing world. In regions without robust medical infrastructure or legal frameworks for anatomical supply, body theft continues. Night guards sit in cemeteries. The pattern repeats. The same labor, the same fears, the same psychological damage, just moved to different geography. The question becomes, did we solve the problem or merely redistribute it? Chapter 16. The question of what was protected. Consider what grave watching actually defended. Not the physical body. That was already dead. The consciousness had departed. What remained was organic material beginning decomposition. From a purely material standpoint, the corpse had no more significance than any other biological matter. But humans don't experience death materially. We experience it spiritually, emotionally, culturally. The body represents the person who inhabited it. Violating that body violates their memory, their dignity, their continued existence in whatever form the living imagine it takes. Grave watchers protected belief. The belief that death meant rest, that burial meant finality, that the dead could not be disturbed. These were necessary fictions for families processing grief. The watchman's presence validated those beliefs, even when he knew they were false, that bodies could be stolen, would be stolen if he failed. The tension. Medicine required what faith forbade. Progress demanded violation. Anatomical knowledge saved living bodies by dissecting dead ones. The moral mathematics was brutal. Every surgeon who learned on stolen corpses later used that knowledge to heal patients. The dead became instruments of life, but families didn't calculate that way. They saw desecration. They saw their father, mother, child dug up and carved apart for students to practice on. The abstract benefit to medical science meant nothing against the specific horror of knowing someone you loved was being dissected. Watchmen stood in that gap. They couldn't resolve the conflict. Law and necessity were locked in opposition, but they could provide time. 6 weeks of protection. Long enough for decomposition to make the body unusable. Long enough for families to feel they had honored the dead properly. Was this enough? The historical record doesn't say. Families who hired watchmen must have believed it mattered. The watchmen who accepted the work must have believed their vigilance meant something. But the bodies were stolen anyway. The trade continued. The medical schools received specimens. So what did the watching accomplish? Perhaps only this. It made families complicit in their own protection. They didn't passively allow theft. They resisted. They hired guards. They tried. Whether it worked was almost secondary to the act of trying itself. The watchman were the visible manifestation of that resistance. They were the refusal to accept that the dead belonged to anyone who could dig them up, even if that refusal failed more often than it succeeded. The grass is still wet at 3 in the morning. The cemeteries are still dark, but no one sits there anymore. Samuel Wright, watching over that grave in Philadelphia in 1827, probably believed his work would always be necessary. Death was permanent. Theft was possible. Someone had to watch. The logic seemed unbreakable. He was wrong. Legal reform ended the need. Technology replaced human vigilance. The profession that had employed thousands simply stopped existing. But the thing he protected, the idea that the dead deserve rest, that burial means security, that families can prevent violation through care and money and hired men, that didn't change. It just became less urgent because the threat diminished. Yet the fundamental question remains, what do we owe the dead? Modern America has mostly decided very little. We cremate more than we bury. We scatter ashes without ceremony. We donate bodies to science voluntarily. Death has become medical rather than sacred, practical rather than mystical. The Victorian fear of body theft seems quaint, superstitious, almost incomprehensible. But that's because we no longer need the bodies. Medical schools have cadaver programs. Families donate willingly. The supply chain is legal, transparent, sufficient. If that changed, if demand exceeded supply again, what would prevent the old patterns from returning? The watchers are gone. The watch houses are empty. The mort safes rust in storage. The systems that required grave watching have been obsolete for over a century. What hasn't become obsolete? The human need to protect what we love, even after death. Even when protection is impossible. Even when the threat is overwhelming, and the compensation inadequate, and the psychological cost breaks us. Grave watching was never sustainable. It damaged everyone who performed it. It barely functioned even at its peak. Legal reform was necessary and overdue. But the men who sat in darkness, who endured fear and cold and isolation, who went slowly insane trying to guard the dead, they were responding to something real. Not ghosts, not curses, but the knowledge that medicine required bodies and poverty provided them, and the law looked away. They couldn't stop it. They tried anyway. Do we still produce work like that? Labor that breaks people, trying to prevent the inevitable? That society needs done, but refuses to support properly? That asks individuals to sacrifice their sanity for collective benefit? Or did we learn something from the watchmen in the graveyard, sitting alone in darkness, waiting for men who would come anyway?